All right, so good morning. So you all enjoyed the party yesterday? Felt like a time trip going back to your youth? For me it did. So to the time when I still had a bit more hair, now it's all fallen down back.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So my name is Phil Cohen.
I'm Kim Mafors.
We both work, we're both Microsoft employees and both in our consulting services area. And this is actually what we do for a living. So the purpose of this session is to go through migration strategies and best practices. And what we're hoping to communicate are some of the learnings we've had, not the theoretical, but these are the processes you need to follow. These are the things you need to consider to make your migrations go as smoothly as possible.
Just out of curiosity, how many of you are in the cloud? How many of you are going to the cloud? How many of you will never go to the cloud? Yeah, I'm actually, my premise is that we all are on the journey to the cloud. For some of us, the journey has not started yet. The good thing there is that actually that gives you ample time to sort of get ready for the cloud. So, yeah, as Phil said, we've been doing these type of things. So I've been working with the cloud for more years than I have fingers, I would say. So a long time, and we've actually had a bunch of migrations moving both from on-premises, different versions of environments to the dedicated cloud and also to the public cloud. So our main focus today will be to talk on all of the processes, and we're not kind of focusing on one of the Microsoft clouds. That's a nice ringtone.
Yes.
So,
Okay.
I feel like I'm starting marching here.
All right, so real quickly, we're going to give some background and then kind of walk through the process that we follow, which is, it's a lot better than that alarm we had yesterday afternoon. So I'm going to give it that. So some background context, and then walk through the conceptual process that we follow. It's a very simple: plan, prepare, and migrate. Okay. So starting off with some background, who's done a major migration event or a replatforming? Can I? Okay, so we have a lot of grizzled veterans in this room, right? So of you folks that have done something like that, anyone think it's simple, easy, goes flawlessly, doesn't lead to any sleepless nights?
the marketing people.
The marketing people, oh gosh.
Sometimes even our salespeople, but that's another story.
Okay.
But in honesty, whenever you do things, you're introducing change. And change, as we say here, is hard. People don't like change. Mm-hmm. Best way in your personal life to verify how much people hate change is, let's say the Christmas dinner. Just go, and your father-in-law typically always sits in this chair. Just go and sit in his chair when the Christmas dinner starts. Mm-hmm. See how well your family likes change.
Yes. And part of what makes it so challenging is you've got the people aspect, and you've got all kinds of expectations and communication that you need to take care of. But you've got a lot of technical challenges involved as well, right? And it involves moving or transforming data. Could be replatforming, especially if you're going to the cloud. It might be changing versions. Operational models change. Your support processes, your help desk has to be prepared. And sometimes you have new capabilities, sometimes you lose capabilities, and all of that needs to be managed. So the key point here is there's a lot of change going on, a lot of moving parts. It's not an easy thing to do, and what we want to do is figure out how we can make this more predictable, right? So that when you do this type of event, it may not be painless, but it can be a better experience both for you and for your users.
One other good thing from kind of a service provider's point of view, or for those consulting companies who are working with the cloud, is that the destination is always the same. So kind of it's easy to plan for the processes. What makes it hard is the fact that the starting point is not the same. So it very much depends on like the level of maturity on your customer side, the level of maturity of their infrastructure. So there's a bunch of sort of pre-work that you need to do. And that's why we sort of, when we do these cloud migrations, like Phil said, plan, prepare, and migrate. So if you don't, well, you could just start preparing things, but if you don't know what you're going to do, how likely is it that you will succeed? So what we've seen in most of our cases, actually the bulk load of the time goes into the two first phases.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is what you actually want to happen. So if the bulk of your time is spent planning and preparing, and in a shorter migration period, you're probably on a more successful track than if you have skimped on the first two and then the migration event drags on. That is not a situation you want to find yourself in. And by the way, does anyone appreciate the irony of having the string figures with the Metro interface?
I have, I've tried to use those boxes, but to me they just look weird, so I'm not. Again, I don't like change. I much more prefer the bulleted list, so anyway.
Okay, so when you're starting an engagement and you're doing the initial part of the planning phase, you need to assess what you have. And that sounds simpler than it is. Most people, most IT departments feel like they know what they have and have a good sense of how things are being used. But what we find is that you really have to drill in, look at your content sources, look at the business processes that are being supported, and understand them so that when you're planning an event, you make sure that you're going to meet your business needs. A key point is, how is that current platform being used, right?
And especially today when you have heterogeneous environments, you may have multiple content management systems, you may have multiple collaboration environments, and if you're planning to consolidate them, be that on premises or moving to the cloud, actually knowing what you have and like knowing the ownership and knowing all of those things, who manages, who has the rights, who has the permissions, all of that pre-work is typically really hard because you actually need to make sure that you invest time in identifying all the stakeholders, all the service managers for all of those things. And it's more often than not than we, in the midst of a migration project, realize that, oh, by the way, we have this system as well that interfaces with our system. We need to plan for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Or we're using SharePoint or Notes to process orders. And, oh, this freeze that I didn't read your email about, all of a sudden, I can't enter sales orders and revenue has stopped flowing. Doesn't make for a very good migration event when that happens. Okay? Something else to be aware of is most environments that you're coming from have a pretty good amount of third-party products involved. And that's true whether it's a...
we have a... Sorry?
Mm-hmm. Whoop. Okay. Whoop. Okay. Oh. Is that any better? Yeah. Okay, we got a thumbs up. That's better. Thank you.
So, like Phil said, one of the things that complicate things is the fact that most platforms have extensibility models, and then trying to map those customizations or extensions to any platform and trying to figure out what's the right way of moving that with you to the cloud. The perfect example here is for Notes customers. So customers who've been on the Notes platform for a long time, they typically, in the initial discussions you have with them, they say, well, we are using these, let's say, 15 base templates, but we have variants of all of each of them. So then, for the migration planning process, so do you need to deal with the kind of the base templates, or do you also need to take into account all the different variations, the different sort of versions of the same template? And those things tend to be really, really complex. So that's why it's so important that to know what you have, to have a clear inventory of all your sort of collaborative sources, the owners, and all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. And by the way, SharePoint's not immune to that as well as a source, because you can add customizations, or even things that weren't done as customizations, like you have a farm that you've brought forward from 2003 and the upgrade to 2007. It left some artifacts behind. Well, a lot of times that's something you're going to need to deal with when you're doing your migration event to get your content clean to be able to make things go smoothly. So that's great. We're talking about how you access what content you have. And if you are coming from a SharePoint environment, there are some built-in tools that you can use. So has anybody played around with enum all webs? Okay. So enum all webs is an STS ADM command. There's a PowerShell equivalent that can go through and inventory a lot of what's been customized or what's missing. It identifies problems. Likewise, a pre-upgrade check. Even if you're going to be using a tool to do the migration, the pre-upgrade check could tell you things that you need to take care of or remediate before you start the migration process. There are third-party tools for assessing what you have. There are, matter of fact, in the partner area downstairs, there are things that will inventory what you have in your farm. Also, you can generate custom tools. So we have some internal ones that we've developed that'll go through, iterate through a farm, and pull back the information that you're going to need to make changes.
A key thing to remember is that I should not step forward. So, is that you need to make sure that you have the right tools, but you should not depend on tools alone. So kind of the consultative or survey-based approach is really, really pivotal, because there are times when you can do an assessment with tools and you come up with certain findings, and if you then just create your strategy direct based on those findings, you may end up in the word of hurt. So as an example, we did a notes migration for a large Nordic bank, and we made the decision criteria that we will only convert those applications that have more than 10 users. So we surveyed the environment and said, well, this is a list of those notes databases that we don't need to worry about. Luckily, we had a kind of a sort of a final checklist where their customers' notes admin went through that list and said, by the way, this application, you have to migrate that. We said, why? We agreed that we will only migrate those applications that have 10 users or more. Well, he said, well, this application has 3 users, but they're the CEO, CFO, and CIO. So again, the word is Orwellian, like all people are equal, but some are more equal than others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So again, if you would blindly just rely on a tool, you would not identify those. Right. Another approach that you could, with a tool-based approach, would be that you would say, I will only move those environments in which content has been changed within, let's say, the last 6 months or so. Again, that's a really risky approach, because there's typical applications that you use just once a year for doing taxes or whatnot. So again, having the right tools is great, but you have to know that the tools alone won't make you happy.
Right, and a key part of that is, tools are going to give you the what, right? But they're not going to give you the how it's being used, and that involves that survey, dealing with subject matter experts around the company, the different business units, and it's all needed to get the complete picture. And just a quick sample. This is something that you can get, using the out-of-the-box tools. This was for one of our customers. You can see it's what we did was we ran the enum webs in a farm that we had done a trial migration to. And what it was picking up here was some third-party components, good third-party components for that matter, that were used in the source environment but hadn't been planned to be put in the destination environment. So we had these legacy references that we needed to go in and correct. By doing this assessment, with a trial upgrade, we were able to find these things and deal with them before they became an issue in the actual migration.
And this is something that you for sure will run into if you're doing an even if you're not considering a migration to the cloud, but even if you're doing just a sort of a database attached type migration from one environment to the other, the fact that you have dependencies on functionalities in the source environment, you just need to make sure that you have the same functionality deployed to the target environment. Mm-hmm. Where this becomes an issue is that what if the vendor does not provide a, let's say, 2013 version of the extension or of that solution? So what do you do then? So then you need to go back and see how can we remediate this before moving to the target environment. And for the cloud, this is even more important because in the cloud, the customization capabilities, as we know, they're more limited in the sense that we don't have as much freedom to sort of deploy things into the environment. Mm-hmm. And that's actually in your benefit, but it does impact the migration planning, that you need to make sure that what's deployed in the environment, sort of customization-wise, and what do we do with them.
Okay. And one last thing, I don't want to give the impression that out of the box with that STS ADM command, you get this type of report. So if you run the command against a typical farm, 3-4 terabytes in size, you get about a half a gigabyte XML document. So what we did on these, what I do on projects is pull it into, use SSIS to pull it into a database and then can run the Excel reports against it. But just something to keep in mind, I don't want to oversell the capabilities. It does require some work to get to this point. Okay. So another key planning aspect is knowing where you're going. So if you're going to the cloud, you've got to understand the capabilities of the target platform. If you're going from Notes to SharePoint, you've got to understand what that target is, right? And you also have to understand how it differs from what you have now. So,
this is
we've got two beach cities. Oops, sorry.
Yeah. I was kind of wondering why in both places you just need money and.
There you go.
So you should have taken like Antarctica and Acapulco because then your stuff would be a bit different.
Yeah. So the reason for the two beach cities is they're similar, so maybe you've got SharePoint on-premise, and you're going to the cloud. There are going to be a lot of similarities, but there are some pretty important differences. If you live in, you might want to get a plane ticket to a different country depending on where you're going. You might have different food when you get there, different currencies, and maybe even different passport requirements. So the point is, don't just take the shallow, they look similar. Put a little more depth into it, really understand that target environment so that you can do good mapping from what you have to where you're going.
And one of the really, really important document for Office 365 and SharePoint Online is the service description. Mm-hmm. So think of that as kind of the Lonely Planet's guide to, if you're thinking the travel analogy. So that document actually describes the capabilities of the platform. Mm-hmm. The challenging thing with our service descriptions is that they tell you what you can do with the service. They're not explicitly telling you what you cannot do with the service. So you have to sort of know SharePoint in order to understand that, okay, I can. If it says I can do this, it probably means, and I'm not mentioning X, Y, Z, it probably means I can't do that. The other key thing with the service descriptions, and also like Jared mentioned in the keynote, is that the cloud, this is the last major multi-year release of the product. So in the future, we'll go into a more frequent service update release type of mode. So this service description that's valid today will be replaced with a new service description once we release the new updated service offering. So make sure that as part of your sort of a knowledge management strategy, you have people who are following the service description and know the changes, because it may be that you make the decision of not moving to the cloud today because I can't do X, Y, Z. Mm-hmm. It may be that that's on a roadmap and you can do that tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So make sure that you sort of it's an ongoing process.
Yep. Want to take this one, Kimo?
Yeah. So the other one is Okay, I want to move to the cloud. So what should I take with me? So again, for those of you who were in James and my session yesterday, most of the customers think, well, I'll just take everything now and deal with it later. So I used the story yesterday when we moved and I had cassette tapes. But there's another thing that actually is kind of interesting moving. So I think of migrations as the same process as if you're moving between houses. So as I said yesterday, we moved between our old apartment to a new apartment a number of years ago. So it's funny how many Microsoft conference T-shirts you get throughout the years. I've been working 11 years with Microsoft, been doing Microsoft stuff for a long, long time. So I opened in the closet, there was like a yay-high pile of Microsoft conference T-shirts. And I'll let you in on a secret. You put these conference T-shirts in a dark place for years, they shrink. So at least that happens for me. So anyway, so then what do you do? So there's multiple strategies. So okay, I get rid of them, or then I had a friend who had the same challenge, and his wife said, get rid of them. No, I said, I actually need to use them when I do like fixing up the house. And she said, how much fixing up will you do? Mm-hmm. So again, but it's in our nature to sort of stick to stuff. So again, making sure that you sort of clean up front is a much, much better thing, because first of all, it's easier to do those things on premises than it is in the cloud. And it's kind of if you're fooling yourself by thinking that I will do it later, later never comes. It never happens. So again, you should think of the way that, okay, what do I need to move across? So should I actually just archive the things that I don't need and leave them behind and only take the thing that I need with me? So as an example, we had a customer for whom we did an content analysis. And what we found out that they were actually using versions in all of their document libraries, even though they did not need to. So out of their SharePoint environment, a huge percentage was just old version information that they did not really need. So again, and they are considering moving data to the cloud. So when you're moving to the cloud, everything has to go over the wire. So the more gigabytes, terabytes you have, the longer time it'll take. Okay?
I admitted that in the presentation.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, again, this gives you an opportunity to sort of clean up and make sure that you're looking at your information architecture and arranging your data the way that you want to have them in your target environment.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out some of those points on the bottom. You need to look at a value proposition, right? So if you've got content, there could be some legal exposure to maintaining it. It could be out of date and not really adding value, but it could be a liability. Your search results, can be diluted, people getting either wrong information because they're looking at things that are out of date, or it's harder to find what they're looking for because there's so much that comes back.
There's typically so much, so if you try this. When you go to your SharePoint environment, do a search on document 1 or title 1, see how many hits you get. Mm-hmm. The number is enormous. Because again, people don't use the environment. They don't put in the document title properties in the SharePoint or whatnot. But actually, this is one of those really, really key things to sort of think of. And then trying to sort of come up with a process together with your customer that you can agree upon, that these are the criteria that we use for moving content. We'll go in a bit more deep detail into this in the session after this, but having a sort of process for triaging content, what do we need? I also want to share an example of like when the legal thing is really, really huge. So we had a customer on SharePoint Portal Server 2001, and when we launched 2003, they said, we can't go there. Okay, we thought that it was just a financial reason. But then when 2007 came, so they wanted to migrate from 2001 to 2007. And what we tried to do is say, well, again, clean up and get rid of old versions. They said, we can't. I said, why not? Well, the things that we store in our document management system are the maintenance plans and reports for our work in nuclear power plants. So we need to be able to have the paper trail if something goes wrong. So we need to be able to go back and say that we did this maintenance that year on that date, and these were the findings. So again, Could a tool give you that answer? No. So again, that's why I'm emphasizing the need. You need to have a tool-based approach, sort of a scan through the data, but you need to use human brain power actually to validate those results.
Okay. Some other things you need to look at are, with your target system, are there things that you can't bring forward with you? They're block file types, like if you're going to the cloud, you can't bring executables. You can't store them in SharePoint. It's just not allowed. Sizing, if you're storing 1 gigabyte files, right now the limit, which probably is going to be changing, but right now the limit's 250 megabytes for a file. So you need a strategy to make your migration go smoothly. Likewise, you may have to do some reorganization, which can lead to changes in your information architecture. So when you're going from multiple web applications down to one, or you've got managed paths in place, those are things that you want to work through and think about how you're going to change your navigation, and also think about how you're going to manage embedded links and update that as well, so that, again, the users have a good experience when they get to the final environment.
Then the interesting thing is, so now we think we know what we have, we know where we want to go. How do we get there? Again, here are then multiple ways of looking at this. Typically, when you're looking at migrating to the cloud, you usually have two approaches. It's the self-service, which we actually in Microsoft used, because we moved our My Sites away from our internal network into Office 365. And the way that MSIT, so Microsoft IT, solved this problem was by sending a mail to all the My Site owners saying that, by the way, by this date, your sort of on-premises My Site will be gone. Make sure that you move the content that you need before that. Could all organizations do that? Most likely not, but our IT is special. Like they tend to, and our people tend to accept probably more nuisance than most customers or most partners would do. So in very many cases, like if you just it becomes a kind of a communication plan issue and having the right way of telling people how to do this. But the My Site thing is actually pretty problematic, because within My Sites you have usually two types of repositories, kind of the public documents and then your private documents. So if you use a tool-based approach, how can you guarantee that that tool that you're running actually has the rights to read your private documents and then upload them in a way that they remain your private documents? Mm-hmm. So the My Site one is pretty complex. So I usually, whenever I have a My Site migration discussion, I usually try to separate that from the shared content, because the shared content one is typically much, much easier. Mm-hmm. So when you're looking at this and choosing your tool, so as we said, there's multiple good vendors out in the product pavilion. Have a chat with them. Some of the things that you need to look out for is, so that you understand the big picture, so costing. So how do they cost the migration? Are you paying for the tool? Are you paying per gigabyte? Are you paying per user or whatnot? So the costing model. And also the capabilities. What are those tools capable of doing? So for instance, for the customer that had these maintenance reports from the nuclear power plants, you need to make sure that if you're moving them to the cloud, that the tool is actually able to retain all the versions and all of those, all the timestamps and users and whatnot. So again, as I said, My Sites are always difficult. Mm-hmm. So, and also what you need to thoroughly test is the throughput when you're moving content to the cloud. So and also if you have to remember, within Office 365, you're running in a shared environment. So we cannot guarantee that the migration throughput is always this, because you may have multiple customers migrating content at the same time. So you need to do proper testing to see that what's an average throughput that you get out of using these tools, and then figure out the duration for your project. Mm-hmm. So what I'm saying, essentially is that you need to make sure that you have a proof of concept or a pilot where you're testing the most common sort of a migration scenarios so that you know roughly how quickly I can move content, what I can move, and what I cannot move.
Mm-hmm. And that experience piece is really important because you need to understand what is going to migrate and what's not. It's not a 100% no tool, internal Microsoft or external is going to get everything in exactly the same configuration that you have in the source environment into the target environment.
So Phil, what would you say has been the most complex things to migrate, in your opinion?
Workflows have been the bane of my existence. How about you?
Well, it's been like those non-content related, but sort of not directly content, but content related, like workflows. Mm-hmm. Sometimes alerts and things like that, but workflows in particular, because workflows, as you know, have two things. So they have the workflow definition, which is efficiently just an XML file or a XOML file. Mm-hmm. XOML, that sounds like a race from outer space that's coming out with flying saucers to kill us. But anyway, a XOML file, but then they have the workflow instances, so the running instances, which are not stored in the normal SharePoint. Well, they're stored in the SharePoint database, but they're not stored in the SharePoint lists or libraries, so it's not easy to get access to that environment. So I would say that it's a safe assumption to make that if you're planning to move content into the Office 365, it's more likely than not that you will not be able to move running workflows. For now, for sure.
And the main reason behind that is there's not, in this current version of SharePoint, an API that third-party vendors or developers can use to pull that information. So you start getting into, well, I'd have to go directly into the content databases and start pulling that, and there are dragons there.
What do we think about people who go directly against the content database? Mm-hmm. We don't like that.
Yeah, not a good thing.
Again, one of the other key things whenever you're doing change, communication. Make sure that you tell your end user what is happening, when it's happening, and more importantly, why it's happening. Mm-hmm. What I found with most of my migration projects is that I can, in most cases, we can ask people to do things themselves if we give them a good reason why, if they understand why. So, for instance, like I think where the Microsoft internal communication from my sites was not good because it just told us, go and do. It didn't really explain why we had to do it this way. So my preference would have been to say that, well, we've investigated all the means for us to be able to move the content on your behalf, but since we weren't able to do that, we'll ask you to do it yourself. Mm-hmm. So this actually also brings down, so what you're saying, why, when things are happening, and then the tone of your communication. It should be sort of designed to meet your customer. So again, what I found in most cases, if I ask people to do things and I give them a good reason, most people will do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a big thing with this too is that migration events, when you go through from beginning to end, usually take some time. And you can't just do an initial communication blast and expect that to be the end of it. Likewise, you can't surprise people at the last minute. So communication usually involves getting a project management function going, a really thorough communication plan that's giving the context, the why, the selling the benefits, and you need to keep selling the benefits because people feel the pain along the way. They don't see the benefits until they get to the new environment. Right? Also, a key component is a user education piece. So things are going to be different. Right? If you're upgrading versions, they're going to be very different. If you're just moving from one location to another, there's still going to be some changes. So what you want to do is make sure that people know what they're getting into and are able to do it and do it efficiently. Because otherwise there's this period after a cutover, after a migration event, where there's a tremendous amount of support calls, satisfaction is very low, and many of these issues can be addressed by proper communications and user education up front.
And this, I would also extend this, especially if you're re-platforming and moving from another platform, make sure that your support organization is well trained on the new environment. Mm-hmm. So this is an area where typically creating these kind of these centers of excellence or centers of expertise within your own organization is a really great idea. So you're teaching sort of ambassadors of the new technology. So you're taking a handful of people that you sort of train up front, and then it's their charter to then go and train their colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, again, one other thing where social media and things like Yammer are really, really powerful, because to have the organization have a way to sort of have these support channels that are more direct and not directly going always via the help desk. So as you saw in the video from Nationwide, when they rolled out the SharePoint Yammer integration, they actually, the first time for them ever, their support calls, the number of support calls went down because they had these kind of the application ambassadors, and they had the support channel via things like Yammer. So it's like I would seriously consider having something like Yammer as part of the kind of upgrade communication tools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In addition to those support functions, also have to be aware that some of the processes you use internally are going to change, right? So that could be things like deploying code, writing code, the upgrade cycles, patching. They just, things that you're doing now will be different. And it's better to try and think that through, make those plans and get it structured before you actually do the migration.
Some of the things which are relevant in SharePoint is like site provisioning. So within your on-premises SharePoint environment, you can enable self-service site creation. So again, in the cloud, on 2010 in the cloud, the only way of creating site collections is via the tenant admin interface. And it's not very likely that you want to give everyone access to that environment to create site collections, because again, why? Well, at the moment, there's limitations on how many site collections we can have as part of a tenancy. So like the site provisioning process is one that you need to think about. So, and it also boils down that you need to think about, well, are we always creating site collections, or so is our information architecture a wide list of shallow site collections, or do we have a smaller number of site collections but a deeper hierarchy? So it sort of drills down into your information architecture. Mm-hmm. And as Phil said, customization models will for sure change. Again, because in the cloud, you don't have the capability of being able to deploy full trust code, which is actually a great idea, that you cannot do that. Because, again, if you remember for those of you who were in the session yesterday, the biggest issue we see with upgrades is customizations. I would say that the biggest issues we see with migrations, again, is functionality that's been added to the platform that does not exist in the target environment. So you need to think about your customization models. And we actually have some things that we've been thinking about on kind of the customization governance models, where you would create different types of categories for different types of customization. So things that end users can do, or things you can do from client side or with client side tools would be type A, and their approval process would be this. And then if you need to deploy code, you need to have a more rigorous process with testing and whatnot. But again, remember in the cloud, the only code that you can run is code within the sandbox. So again, that has an impact on if your current customization model is heavily relying on full trust functionality, or if you're using functionality like feature stapling, you cannot do that in the cloud. So you need to change your customization models.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So transitioning from plan into prepare, like Kimmo was saying, there's some changes in customizations, right? And changes in what you might have in place currently. So you might need to sunset some of what you have. But you also have to look at what remediation might have to be done to make it so that the content is still accessible after the customization is removed.
So one of those areas could be that if you have not enforced any quotas on your site collections, you may have huge site collections. Well, are huge site collections okay in the cloud? Well, we're for instance, in the cloud, you cannot create a site collection without assigning a quota to it. And also, if you look at the cloud, the total amount of storage that you have is based on the contract that you have with SharePoint Online. You can purchase more content, but typically you get a fixed number of megabytes per licensed user. So that's a thing that you might need to remediate when you're thinking about moving content to the cloud.
Ideally, we're going to do these remediation activities in the on-premises farm because we have more control over it. So if we're removing assemblies, trying to write scripting or programs to go in and touch a lot of code, to touch a lot of content, it's much easier to do so on-premise. So these are things we want to do before we migrate. Likewise, we're going to have to develop a map between the existing and the target information architectures and deal with things like our collisions. If you've got two site collections with the same names that are in different web apps, when you combine the web apps, something's got to be renamed, right? So this is where you want to be doing that. Also, it's a great opportunity to look at, does our information architecture reflect the way we want our organization to be set up? Are we taking advantage of metadata, or are we just getting these really deep hierarchies that are difficult to navigate? It's a good opportunity for that. And we discussed in the assessment, figuring out what needs to be archived or deleted or migrated. Well, when you're in the preparation phase, you actually go through and do that archival or deletion function.
And again, as I said, people are really hesitant of getting rid of content because they think they might need it. That's why most of us store old mails in PSTs, because we think that we might need them. Like, how likely is it that you would need the lunch invitation from 3 years ago that should we go and have a pizza today? But
that's pretty important to me, by the way.
Yeah, I know you like pizza.
Yeah.
So I remember when I was in the university, I was studying in a steel mill in the research department, and it was a funny situation. I had a meeting with their lead engineer, so we were discussing a thing, and his assistant came in, and she told him that I found this folder of old research reports. What should I do with them? And then she handed the folder to him. He looked through them and said, well, throw it away. And then she turned, and while she was walking out, he said, but make copies first. Because it's so ingrained in us, like we think that like deleting things is bad thing. It's actually not. So you actually need to, the cleanup thing is really, really important. It benefits you in many ways. Like Phil said, it will benefit you in the fact that your search results will be more relevant because you're removing a lot of the noise. You keep the content that's relevant.
So we talked in plan, we want to make sure we allow time to do a pilot. Some of the key things with doing a pilot is it's a chance to iron out the process. So you're going from theory, what you think it's going to happen in terms of results, speed, the capabilities, and the pilot should either verify or correct what you're assuming on how things are going to go. It's also a great opportunity to get users hands-on in the target environment in a pilot way, so that they can then sign off on the approach and the results. And that is a great way to get that buy-in so that the migration event is deemed a success. Some key things with any migration tool is really understanding the settings and testing to make sure you're getting the results. I had a recent engagement where a migration had some issues because of the way somebody did permissions. And it created duplicate permissions in the target environment. We had to go through a large cleanup process to fix it. You want to make sure you're getting the fidelity. Is the metadata being brought forward, and is it being brought forward in the way you expect? We already mentioned throughput. And by the way, if you're doing a pilot migration, you want to test it at a like time. If you're going to be trying to do, migrating 24/7, you're probably going to get different throughputs when people are on the source system and at night or over the weekends. And you need that data to be able to plan appropriately.
But remember, again, even if you do that and you sort of map the throughput, you don't know what the other users on the same environment will do at the same time. Mm-hmm. So again, you need to have the throughput mapping, but you need to have conservative estimates. And one thing that we didn't put in the slides, but which is really, really, really important. So if you're doing a pilot against Office 365, make sure that if you're using a test tenant, that you create that using a name that you will not use in the future. We've had more than once cases where some employee from the customer side has, let's say I work for Contoso and I'm in their IT and I wanted to test out Office 365. So I created a test tenant with the name of Contoso. And then, so I have that, I'm doing my small tests, but at the same time, Contoso is looking at actually doing a real production deployment with Microsoft. Well, guess what? The Contoso name is taken. So whenever you're doing pilots and you're creating test tenants, make sure that you're creating a name that either is indicative or, so you could say like Contoso migration test pilot, so that would be your tenant name. Because don't use the real name for your pilots, because the way that we can if you do that and we want to use that tenant for other purposes, you'll have to delete that tenancy and wait for anything between 60 and 90 days before you can register the real Contoso tenant. So again, pilots, test tenants, make sure that you use the word pilot or test in your tenant name. Mm-hmm. It'll save you from a word of hurt.
Yeah. And then a key thing when you're doing a pilot and when you're laying out your plan initially is to incorporate the learnings from the pilot. So I know that sounds really shallow, right? I mean, why else would you do a pilot? But if you haven't built in time to update your project plans, update your communication plans, update your user education based on what your findings are, why do the pilot, right? So, I mean, it's a significant event. You've got to assimilate your learnings, and then you have to push them out to the organization and make sure that your go-forward plans reflect what you've learned from that pilot. So you go through, you do a pilot, you've figured out all your settings, and then you go in and you start your migration event and you have a keystroke error. Missed a setting. Not good, right? So ideally, you want to automate everything possible to make it as repeatable as possible. So script what you can.
The biggest benefit to me with scripts is that they fail the same way every time until you get it right. So.
Yep, exactly. All right, so you want to do everything you can to prevent the introduction of errors. And another key thing is developing your cutover strategy. So when now you know what your throughput is, you can figure out how long you're going to have freezes. You can figure out if you're going to bring over many web applications or do it one at a time, so a big bang or a gradual sort of approach. So, again, really important things to work through in the prepare phase.
The freeze period is a discussion that you need to have with the business stakeholders. You cannot have that discussion with IT alone, because well, IT will say, our users will accept it. Mm-hmm. Business will say, no, we won't. So you need to make sure that like what's acceptable, and you need to plan. So again, which is why the communication plan is so important. So let's say that we will do migration. Let's say we have a strategy of migrating 15 site collections over 5 weekends. So we need to make sure that we have then a clear plan. So for those people who are collaborating on those site collections which are in the process of being migrated, how should they work during that weekend? Well, probably they shouldn't, but in reality some people will. But how should they act? So should they take the relevant documents locally and then after the weekend go and upload them to the target environment? It's up to the sort of migration team to figure out what's the right way of dealing with these freeze or cutover periods. Mm-hmm. Again, there's no one single truth to say that this is the optimal, only way of doing things, but you need to have a plan for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you notice there were less prepare slides than there were planning slides. Well, there are even less migrate slides. When you actually get to the migration phase, you're moving content, right? At some point, you're probably going to have a freeze, like Kimmo was saying. Ideally, you'd like to throw the source farm into some read-only configuration so that people can still access content. It's not it is a freeze, not a blackout. You want to make sure you keep your source farm or source system intact anyway, because it's going to be needed for validation. So people need to refer back to it to validate that the new environment did indeed receive the migrated content correctly. It also gives you a contingency. If something goes wrong, you need a failback plan. Right? Most tools let you do syncs where you can sync the body of content over and then handle the deltas afterwards. That helps cut down on the freeze period. That's something you need to validate with the vendor when you're picking a tool. Allow time for testing and acceptance and get it scheduled. And testing and acceptance isn't just like, oh, I can get to the site, yep, looks good. I mean, they really should go in, check the permissions, check that the content's there, navigation is correct, links are working correctly. Need to have resources scheduled and available to address defects.
So we did a quite complex migration. It was an on-premises migration from 2007 to 2010, and we had a process where we were operating on a site collection at a time. So we had a clear defined role. So we had one team whose responsibility it was to sort of export the content from the 2007 environment, another team who then imported that content into 2010, and then we had a quality assurance role from the customer side to make sure that, yep, this looks good, into production with this site collection. So the challenge that, and we've used the same approach in multiple cases, the challenge that we'll almost every time have seen is that the sort of quality assurance role actually takes much, much more time than you thought. So what we saw as a bottleneck in most of the cases was the sort of validation part. So what I highly recommend is making sure if you have that process that you sort of make sure that the customer provides enough resources to do that, or if that's not possible, try to see if there's a way that you can sort of script something that would help them to see that, well, if the source environment had 19 documents and the target environment has 19 documents, it's probably the right documents. But make sure that you have kind of those roles and responsibilities well defined, and make sure that you have the buy-in from the customer side of doing that. Because unfortunately, quite often we're in a situation where we get, well, it's your responsibility, you should do that. But I'm usually very firm in making sure that I want to have the customer doing the validation before we launch things into production.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, it sounds simple, but the point of doing the migration is at some point doing that cutover, right? So it becomes your production system. So making sure you've got things like DNS cutover scheduled, making sure that you start restricting access so people don't just continue using the old source systems. An important part of the migration process.
One thing why having there's two schools of thought of having the old system available or not having. One reason why it's really good to have it available in a read-only is the fact that people send links over emails. And there's no way that we can retroactively go and change people's emails to point to the new environment. Mm-hmm. So most people will look through their email and say, oh, this was the link to the document. Mm-hmm. So then what you should do is make sure that you have this read-only, and then for each, let's say, home page of the site, have somewhere with yay high letters say that the content has moved here. Mm-hmm. Again, communication plan, making sure that the users understand that the old environment is going away.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And we mentioned the importance of training up your help desk to make in your support organization so that they're able to support the new system. But another thing is scheduling them so that you have the capabilities, the capacity to handle the increased support requests that will come in when you do this type of migration event. And some of it is just the oh yeah, it's a different interface, I can't find it, you know, something's broken, right? I mean, a lot of the requests are things that user education should have covered, but the fact of the matter is, haven't heard of any migrations that have gone to the point where there wasn't at least a transient spike in support after the event. So it's better to plan for it. Okay. So in conclusion, right, you know, the planning and communication are really the significant parts of the effort, and to a large extent drive people's views of whether the migration was successful or not. Make sure you've got contingency plans in place. Nobody wants anything to go wrong, but it's a lot better to have a way to roll back if something does go wrong than to have to try and make it up on the fly under pressure. Right? Do the pilot, test out your approach, test the tools. Right? When you've done the migration, allow time to test the results and do that quality assurance. And do things that are great for the organization. Right? These are significant events, right? And hopefully the reason for doing it is to realize some real business value, to cut down on costs, to increase the ability to collaborate, to give a more stable environment, a safer environment. So don't lose in all the minutiae that you have to plan through the big picture of why you're doing it and the positive value that will be received at the end.
So here are some of the other like Office 365 sessions that are kind of looking at this space. So as you know, there's plenty of SharePoint Online sessions, but like these are the ones that we kind of thought are relevant.
Mm-hmm. And a couple of them have already passed, but as you probably know, MySPC, you'll have access to look at presentations or recordings after the fact. So the fact that like the hybrid overview is already passed, don't let that discourage you. You can still get the content if you need to.
Well, thanks very much. We'll be, I don't know. Yeah,
great.
So if you have questions, please use the mics.
Good question.
Yeah, do you recommend to upgrade on-premise 2013 first and then go to the cloud, or go from 2010 to 2013?
So the question was, do we recommend upgrading to 2013 on-premise first and then moving to the cloud, or to do the migration and have the upgrade happen either in flight or there? And
it depends on your tool choice, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, my recommendation would be to upgrade on premises first, because then you know that the content and all of that works in 2013. So because if you're moving from 2010 on-prem to cloud 2013, then you're doing two changes. You're doing a migration and a version change. Mm-hmm. So that's why I would do the upgrade first and then migration.
And I'd also add, it somewhat depends on your business drivers. So there's not a definite right or wrong way. Some of the tools will do the upgrades in flight, and that can be a nice, because then you're getting it out of the way at one time rather than hitting somebody with multiple events. So really, it depends.
Are there any template Microsoft project plans out there that cover migration that we can use as a starting point with tasks and things?
We have some of the not necessarily migration. They're more kind of the upgrade worksheet and sort of things that you can find on TechNet. But I haven't seen any that's directly migration specific. That's actually a really good idea. And let me take up that with our UX team to see if we could provide something which would kind of a high level have the things that we have found to be relevant as tasks.
Yeah. So upgrade definitely. Migration, I agree. I don't know that there's anything out there, and we'll definitely check on that, because it would be a good value.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. What tools from Microsoft are available for automating the migration?
Sorry?
What tools from Microsoft are available for automating the migration?
From the product group, none. Mm-hmm. PowerShell, that's not a tool. That sense. So we, as Microsoft, we don't have any migration tools as part of the SharePoint product.
Mm-hmm. So it's strictly a partner play at the moment.
Yeah. So there are offerings from Microsoft Consulting Services for doing that, but then they are more consultative approach. And then there's the vendors at the product pavilion.
Are there any rumors of tools that might be released in the future from Microsoft?
None that I have heard of. I've been asking for them since SharePoint Portal Server 2003. So
There are some rumors because I've been starting them, but I haven't heard anything more valid than that. I'm sorry.
What's your recommendation for a hybrid solution like on-premise as well as Office 365, and if there is any guidance or best practices for that?
So Brad Stevenson did a session Tuesday morning on hybrid. So
I switched back, but those were full sessions.
yeah,
On,
some of the key things is like depending on the level of hybridness. I'm inventing words here. So it's the fact that like certain workloads are more hybrid friendly than others. So for instance, social today it's not really hybrid aware. So because social is so tied to the user profile service application. So effectively, if you are using the social capabilities and you're sort of rating and tagging content, it goes to that user profile service where that content resides. So if you're tagging stuff in the cloud, you won't see that on-premise and vice versa. So that's why things like Yammer is interesting, because it actually helps to sort of take out that construct. But with hybrid, I would say that what you should look at is try to see which workloads you can run entirely in the cloud and run them in the cloud. And then do hybrid for things like you could have, we support federated search. So you could have, on your search page, you would have your on-premises results and the cloud results. It's not as seamless as it is, for instance, in Exchange. But again, it's a more complex thing. But Brad, Steve, Mark, do you know of any other hybrid sessions than Brad's? Yeah.
it's on the screen.
Yeah, so it's 145. Yeah. So again, it depends on, like, you need to look at the workloads and see where it makes sense to run them. So for many customers, we've actually seen that they keep certain, like, critical or line of business type of things on premises because they need direct connectivity to line of business systems, but then they're moving the collaboration workload to the cloud. Okay. And then they achieve the hybridness via search.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
How much is the migration is complex from on-site SharePoint 2013 to Office 365 if I want to just migrate a couple of site collections? So.
Well, the main thing when you're moving from, let's say, from on-premises to the cloud is, if you're moving, let's take the easy one. If you're doing an on-premises migration, you have access to the environment. You can do a database attach, you can do things. You can sort of copy physical entities to servers. When you're working against the cloud, you need to use either the web services APIs or the WCF endpoints to do things. So you're moving all the content over the wire. So because of that, your performance varies depending on your network bandwidth and your network capacity. And it's typically, on premises you can do things much quicker, but then in the cloud you have the latency of the cloud and the fact that if you're doing, let's say, using like the list web service for each item, then you have a lot of back and forth. So, but the main difference to me is the fact that when you're moving stuff against the cloud, it goes to the cloud. So you don't have the luxury of running things on the server. Mm-hmm. Did that answer your question, by the way?
Yeah, that's right.
Earlier in your talk, you addressed the difficulties in moving running workflows and workflows across to the cloud during a migration. You actually mentioned at the beginning also alerts, but you sort of skipped over that. Can alerts be migrated? And can they also be migrated to the 2010 environment? Because that's the current difficulty I'm having right now.
So with the thing is, if you look at both workflows and alerts, so both of them are usually tied into to user identities. So one of the things, if you're moving from on-premises to the cloud, you're changing identities. So your domain /user on-premises, in the cloud it's a claim user. So if you have a tool that moves alerts, you need to make sure that this alert was created by domain/user, and it alerts on this document library. So you will get that alert definition. You can move that programmatically, but you need to make sure that you then map the domain/user into the claims identity. And so it depends on the capabilities of the migration approach. With alerts, it's easier because we have APIs for accessing that. With running workflows, it's harder because there's no public APIs in the cloud that a piece of software can talk to identify to sort of dehydrate the workflow instance and say that the next performer is not the domain/user, but this claims identity. So that's the main problem that's why workflows are harder to solve than alerts.
But if I understand you correctly, alerts can be migrated programmatically, and can that also be done in 2010?
So I believe so. I haven't looked at the APIs in that level against. So I know for sure, like on-premise, you can do whatever you want with alerts. With workflows, it's tough even on-prem. So I need to look at the web services available for alerts. But send me an email, kimmo.fors@microsoft.com, and I'll respond to that.
Thank you very much.
Hi. Are there considerations with content types and taxonomy for migration?
Yes. So
could you elaborate?
So the main challenge with 2010 is that there's no remote APIs for adding like managed metadata, for instance. So the only way of entering managed metadata into Office 365 on the 2010 platform is by creating these items manually in the term store or by importing them via CSV file into the term store. So is that a problem? Well, if you're populating content programmatically from an on-premises environment, so metadata is challenging in the way that you have a metadata column has two things. It has a value and it has a reference to the item in the term store. So today so let's say that I have a term dog and it has the ID of 1. So I create the term dog in the cloud. It may very well be that it gets the item like ID 15. So if I'm moving that piece of content with ID 1 to the cloud, my dog becomes a cat. But again, with Wave 15, we have remote APIs to talk to the managed metadata service and to content types in more detail. So the problem we have today is going away with the next wave.
Yeah, I think in 2010, sometimes you have to pre-create like profiles or pre-create content types, and then you can sync over the references, but you can't get the definition brought over automatically. Is that?
Yes, it's much trickier in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked a little bit about the proof of concept and everything to test your environment and all those kind of things. What's the best approach to do a proof of concept? So just get like a trial version of the Office 365 and just kind of go that way? And how can my developers kind of test their functionality and things like that? Again, is it just the sandbox solution will work automatically, or what's?
Yeah, so this is kind of we have different terms for different things. We have proof of concept pilots, whatnot. But effectively, my recommendation is create a test tenant which has a different name than your production tenant will have.
Okay.
Because again, if you consume the tenant name in your pilot, then you'll have to wait at least 90 days before that name gets released to the production environment. So I would set up a separate test tenant, and then depending on the type of work you do, so if you need to think about like adding users, then you might even set up directory synchronization from your like dev AD against that tenant, and then for your SharePoint developers, they would just then work against that tenant.
Okay.
One of the things that is quite complex on the 2010 platform is the fact that application lifecycle management is very much a manual task. Because if you're doing a WSP and you have 1,200 site collections where you need to use that, you need to upload the WSP to all those site collections where you're using that. Mm-hmm. Whereas with full trust, you just need it once.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. And
So there's no way of on-premise to test those things, right? You actually have
So
to get...
actually, so most of the things that you test on-prem, if you're building a sandbox solution, will work in the cloud.
Okay.
There's some exceptions. There's some APIs and some namespaces in the Office 365 sandbox that are different from the on-prem sandbox.
Okay.
So there is a Codeplex project that I created called, I think it's O365 FX Copy Rules. So if you're doing a sandbox on premises, you can use my FX Copy Rules to test if this sandbox will work in the cloud.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah. So I think it's O365 FX Copy Rules. So you just install that in your Visual Studio machine, you run FX Cop, and it'll tell you that you're using this namespace, which is not supported in Office 365.
Perfect.
And some people are using dedicated site collections that they lock down for doing some of that sandbox sort of testing, especially if they need to work through their permission models.
Yeah.
Right, because it gives you're using the same directory synchronization then, so your results are more indicative. But you have to be careful. You should be doing good testing before you do that, because you don't want to clobber your environment.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
Right.
Well, thank you again.